Hello guys, welcome back to Rise Above with me, your host, Double LMC. Guys, regular viewers have known that we've been attempting to tell the truth on this station about what's going on with the Coviet 1984 situation. We've been making comparisons to previous communist regimes, to the Soviet Union. Today in the studio, I'm very, very lucky to have a very special guest with me for an exclusive interview, a gentleman by the name of Jay, and he actually grew up on the wrong side of the Iron Curtain. I'm not going to give him any more of an introduction. I want to get Jay into the stream and to get him to tell his story before we bring things a little bit more up to date with what's going on with our current situation. Welcome to Rise Above, my friend. How you doing?
Thanks for having me. Good, thank you.
We're very, very pleased to have you here. Now, if you would just like to take a few moments to tell your story about growing up in East Germany, under Soviet control, on the other side of the Berlin Wall. What was that like?
Well, where do you start? What was it like? When I was a child, when you become conscious of the surroundings that you live in and everything else, then this system of the communist state, of the socialist state, was already well established. So it wasn't anything that crept upon anybody living there. It was already well established.
Sure.
Year upon year, it got more refined in its restraints and its in its doctrines and so forth. But as a child, you didn't,
you had nothing to compare it to.
You were not aware of any changes because
Sure.
you just grew up and it became the norm. In my case, it was somewhat different because we weren't exactly a mainstream family. I came from a divorced household. My parents divorced when I was 10. We were 3 siblings. My biological father was one end of the spectrum. He was a committed party man. I have very little recollection of him or his activities at all. I've got some.
So he was a member of.
He was a member of the SED. German viewers will know what that means. Sozialistische Einheitspartei Deutschland,
So
which was
the
the
German
ruling party,
Communist Party.
the Communist Party, yeah. And he believed in it wholeheartedly. He was a good man, but he was part of that system. And this is very little I know about because I was so young, and my consciousness at the time politically was not at all refined or developed at all. So he was that end of the spectrum. And my parents divorced. My mom, after having been on her own for a short while, but my sibling and I, the other two were with my dad, she found another partner, and he was the other end of the spectrum. He was an ex-submariner, considered 16 years older than my mom. He was an ex-submariner from the war, a man's man, a private business owner, of which were very few in East Germany at the time. The economy was mainly state-run. Private business was tolerated, quite often welcomed, and of course it wasn't admitted but well needed. So that was the father figure.
So private businesses weren't illegal, or
No.
they were permitted.
They were permitted, and
Okay.
they were not discouraged. They were beyond tolerated. They were part of society. There were many. Don't forget that after the war, I was only born 22 years after the war. So all the skilled people were of war.
And how old are you, if you don't mind me asking?
Master mechanics, master masons.
Sure. How old are you, if you don't mind?
I'm
me?
54.
You're 54 years of age. Okay.
So, of course, there was a base of a lot of private enterprise and private industry. And it wasn't discouraged. It wasn't discriminated upon. It was taxed just like any other business. There were no activities that would have been in any way damaging the economy by treating this minority of businesses differently.
So far, you've painted a picture of most things being state controlled, but you're still allowed to have private businesses. Maybe this isn't the idea that everybody has of the Soviet Union. Do you think there is a lot of misconceptions about what life was like from, because you've been around Westerners for how many years have you been over here now?
I've been in the UK since 1998.
1998. Yeah. So that's a fair old amount of time. We're talking.
That's just in the UK, but I've been
talking 30 years
in the States, and I lived in Canada since, and just a spell in Spain. So I've seen enough of a comparison.
And so, what was day-to-day life like in the Soviet in as a part of a vessel of the Soviet Union compared to decadent Western life?
Well, if I start sort of by naming some of the similarities
Okay.
To Western life, you had a job. Everybody had a job. There was no unemployment.
No unemployment.
Absolutely not. If you're unemployed or willfully unemployed, that means by your own doing, then you put yourself in the outcast category of citizens.
Okay.
A lazy person, a bum,
Sure.
an undesirable. So yeah, it was 100% unemployment. How effective that was for the economy, I mean, later on proved to be a great factor. But everybody was employed, so you went to work. Your partner most likely went to work. If you had children, you could afford both of you to go to work because they were looked after by state facilities from a very young age. You had your holidays like everybody else, 2-3 weeks a year. You took your sick pay like everybody else, your sick leave. In terms of medical facilities, it was provided, it was free, and it was modern by the standards of the world back then. So all that was the general daily life was pretty well organized, and it was a decent life. We didn't want for anything. Children weren't going hungry.
Things were provided for.
There were no poor. There were some that had a few less than others, depending on your profession. Some earned more than others, but there were not really any poor. Of course, when you bring this further down the line to materialistic needs of people and wants and desires, if you wanted to own a motor vehicle, then either you bought a pretty crappy second-hand car, such as an old Trabant, an old Moskvich, an old Lada, an old Saporosh. Some might not even remember what that is anymore.
I'm not familiar with those cars.
If you wanted a new one, then you had to register your child upon birth, because the waiting time for a new car was 15 years.
Wow.
And that was the official line. So in 15 years' time, so if you first say you did it when at your birth height, you got to be 15. Most people did it when they're of age, like 14, 15, and then when they were 30. By the time they, were older, had a driving license and earned a bit of money, they would then receive the vehicle. And there was a waiting list, and it was categorized, it was well organized, and then it would come to everybody. So it was not a wild goose chase. So these are some of the more curious things,
Yeah, that's interesting. I had no idea about that.
Mm-hmm.
So those are the similarities, or you're talking about the better advantageous side.
Yeah, but I'm already slipped into dissimilarities. I'm talking about the car, for example.
Yeah, that's not similar.
I mean, the biggest change, of course, or the big difference was that we could not travel where we wanted to travel in terms outside the borders of our sovereign nation.
That rings a bell.
As it was back then, other than the Soviet-controlled or communist states which we were affiliated with. And that was Bulgaria, Romania, Hungary, Czech Republic, Poland, Soviet Union throughout.
And if you cross borders into another one of the Soviet states, were you asked to see your papers?
Yeah, you would have a passport. Every citizen had a passport.
So you had an internal passport for inside the Soviet Union.
You had a traveling passport. We had an ID card, a driving license, and a passport. These were the main documents. Most people who didn't have a driving license, they would just operate an ID card itself. But this one you obtained, I believe, you was 14 when you were given your first ID card. That was the age of that. And if you went abroad, then of course you had to have a passport, and every East German citizen could apply for that, and most did it automatically, because you would go. The Czech Republic was quite close, Poland was quite close, but for someone within just a hop across the border. So just about everybody I knew, and certainly myself, had a passport already.
Maybe that's a higher percentage than people have passports. Not everyone has a passport in the UK at the moment. It seems like most people back then did have a passport.
I think some of them don't need to bother now, do they?
Well, no, the passport isn't worth the paper it's printed on at the moment, is it? So what kind of restrictions were there placed to you apart from freedom of travel and freedom of movement?
Well, the obvious one that everybody remembers or everybody takes into account when talking about the Soviet-controlled states or the Eastern Bloc is the restricted ideology. The suppression of thought, the suppression of free thinking, the persecution of people who think other than this outside the party lines, away from party lines.
Yeah,
and so so politics was straying from the path of the from the party line was a dangerous thing to get involved with.
And throughout your youth, when people tend to be more rebellious, etc., did you ever have any thoughts when you were growing up about whether the party line was correct or not, or were you not interested in politics?
Listen, when I grew up, I tell you, my stepfather was an ex-submariner. 80,000 submariners went into the war. 20,000 I think came back. So he was a man then who had, after the war, who had a great struggle building up his own private business. I need to go back a little bit to make you guys understand a few things. He built up a private business in the communist state. He knew what he wanted. And after coming home from the war, there were many things he was still afraid of. So he always said, I lived through Hitler, I lived through the war, I lived through the communists. And he told me from a very early age, in my lifetime, I see the cement wall come down in Berlin. And he lived to see it. He always said that. It was to me, it was gospel. So at home, my understanding of it, which is quite unique. I don't think there were that many people really who had that kind of upbringing. Communists were gangsters, oppressors. They were all the things that are frowned upon in a free society, And my dad let me know that every day, and I wasn't going to be part of this.
Okay.
So I grew up with this thinking the worst of these people, and I wanted no part of it.
But did you keep that to yourself?
Well,
or did
absolutely. Well, I could keep it to myself within a degree, but then when it became a conflict of interest quite often. In school, when you in East Germany, when you go to school, you were 6 years old. You start your first grade, first class, as we call it in Germany, and you became automatically a young pioneer, which was the first stage of the Hitler Youth, only in the communist stage.
Yeah.
So you became a young pioneer. So we're part of an organization, not necessarily a bad thing. You became a member of something, of a structure. That structure happened to be communist and full of already seeding ideological ideas and wrong ideas. That is neither here nor there at that age, but it was implemented. So
Sure.
I was part of that, of course, because I was already in that organization before I got under the command of my stepdad. But then when I turned 16, that was quite a crucial age. Then you were expected, I think it was 16, some people might correct me, it may have been 14, I can't quite remember what age it was. You then joined automatically the next stage, which was the FDJ, Freie Deutsche Jugend, Free German Youth Movement.
Sounds exactly like Hitler Youth.
Well, this is the Hitler Youth proper. And equivalent, without the military. There was also a section of the military training, which is called the GST, which you could join, which was a voluntary kind of thing. But any boy with any bolts in the pants would have joined them. Other than that, it would have been a joke. So I was part of that for sure, the GST, but I never joined the FDJ. My dad said to me, if you join that mob, you don't stick your feet under my table and eat my food. So I had to explain that in school.
Oh, right.
And
so
I didn't.
You told the truth.
Yeah, I said to him, I need somewhere to live. I need somewhere to eat and sleep. And my old man says, don't come home with a blue rag on your back.
Let me ask, at any point when you were expressing those views, did you think you could be putting your father in danger?
No, not at all, because my father was God, not a teacher. I was only afraid of one thing in the world. I was respectfully afraid. That was my dad. Everybody
you were more
else was
afraid of
just
your
there.
dad than the Communist Party.
No, I'm talking about my stepdad. By then, I had lost contact with my regular contact with my biological dad. He was no longer the picture as such. So when I'm talking about my dad, as for reference, this will be my
And
stepdad.
he was a starch anti-communist.
Yeah, he was not a Nazi, and I do reject the term in most broad things anyway. Not because I'm a supporter of anything, but people just have to get sometimes a bit down to the correct terms when they're going back in history.
Yeah.
No, he was a soldier in the war. He was a Navy man. He was a submariner, and that's all he had to do with the war. He was glad to come home in one piece.
Yeah, because let's be real about it. Not every German man who fought in the war had the ideology of the Third Reich.
All my obviously having a second dad, I had another set of step parents. All my granddads were in the war, all of them came back luckily, but some more damaged than others. But we're a family of warriors, and none of them by choice.
Yeah, and that's an important thing to remember. None of them by choice.
Into it. So to get back to the subject, so I had to explain that in school that I wouldn't be part of that, and I was never really so much of an outcast because we were in a rural area. It wasn't a city area. It was a rural area. I think that the next bigger settlement where my school was about 3,000 people. It was a close-knit community. We were a class of 32. We respected each other. We were taught to respect each other. And there was nothing that the decision that my dad made for me and that I had to carry forward impacted on my life in school at all. I wasn't excluded from anything. I excluded myself quite often because I had other things on my mind. But it wasn't so much so. I mean, all that changed when I went to the Navy then, so.
Do you think it would have been different if you lived in a city?
Yes, because where the state control, the control of the minds of the people, and especially when you talk in political terms, was largely observed, monitored, interfered with by the Stasi, which everybody knows, Staatssicherheit. The Stasi learned their trade from the Gestapo. They had a perfect blueprint. They implemented this after the war without the help of the Russians. It's a myth that the Russians created, that the KGB helped them. No, there were much cleverer people already in East Germany, old timers who were imprisoned themselves by the Gestapo, who later became officials and henchmen to the Stasi. So they've controlled the daily life. So of course it was important to control your mind. You have to know what people are thinking to control their minds. So it was easier to infiltrate and control groups that are less united and a city living inherently in history. Then and today is it's less united. It's more anonymous than in a village. I grew up in a village, and neighboring villages. My friends came from villages. Our nearest town, the biggest provincial headquarters town, was 65,000 people. Still small by today's standards.
Yeah.
So yeah, it was easier in the cities to control people. People were more controlled, and neighbors were, of course, encouraged to keep an eye on their neighbors. Some were actively recruited. Some were rewarded with tidbits. It was history shown that anybody can read up on this. It was a well-orchestrated, a well-machine of a surveillance state.
A surveillance state. Mm-hmm. And, from my understanding of this, and thank you so much for sharing, it almost got to a state where people within their own family had no idea if other members of the family were informants, were secret police, were government spies. So is it fair to say that a mindset was adopted by most people that you sort of assumed that anybody could be?
For sure. You were really selective, first of all, who you associated with. Outsiders were viewed with suspicion. Outsiders, by outsiders who you see twice a month, that's already an outsider. If you see him twice a week, then you might be in a closer rank.
So even if they live in your town,
oh, absolutely, yes.
You don't see someone on a regular basis, they would be considered an outsider.
Well, yeah, they wouldn't be part of the close knit circle that can be trusted.
So let me ask. You had these thoughts from your stepfather, who was a staunch anti-communist. You said you didn't keep them to yourself. You had to express them at certain times. Do you know of anyone that was an identified dissident? Do you have a recollection of anyone like that as you were growing up?
Yeah, absolutely. I have a school friend of mine who his parents where his mother came originally from Hamburg. She fell in love with my friend's father, who was from my hometown. He was a sailor at the time, so he took her from Hamburg to East Germany. They married, had children. But of course, her mindset never changed. She said, what's going on here? This is just weird, And after their children were 14, 15, my age, the friend of mine in particular, they've decided there's more wrong with this state than there's right. So they became involved in active disagreement of the state's methods, of the ideological implementations and everything else. So they applied to leave East Germany. You could, if you were a political opponent and a staunch, a regular, and really deep-seated troublemaker, then they had no desire to keep you there because you were that piece of infection that could.
No opposition is allowed, basically.
No opposition is allowed. So if you were a single individual, imprisonment would be the best deterrent for a long time. Some didn't come back. Some of them died of a cough because they were shot in the head. all these records, there are official records out there. You need to take the picture. But if you were a family, that was a different kettle of fish. How do you deal with 4 people, as was in their case? So they were granted, they were kicked out. And once you applied to leave East Germany, you didn't know when you would get the okay. And if you got the okay, you only had about 24 hours to pack your bags. So it's from the day on, and people will verify that, from the day on that you launch your application, you better have your suitcase ready, because they come any day or night and drive you to the border and kick you out. This would often be done as an exchange with West German officials for a spy, for another person that they wanted, for a deal. So with the more,
so you were used as bartering.
They're used to bartering people. Whether people were in some instances, not all, I can say all, but in some instances, people were a commodity for the state to trade with.
It also seems like what you just said there about people in the cities that were more easily sort of enveloped in the almost said Soviet mindset. Sounds like a psychological operation was done on an entire population.
Yeah, pretty effectively as well.
Very effectively, you would say. You're telling me that the only people that really managed to, at least ideologically, escape it were the ones in close-knit communities out in the countryside, and city life, as we know, breaks people down with their ties with other people. Everyone becomes more compartmentalized, more individual, and that's when I guess the psyop is much more effective.
Yeah, well, not everyone was not everyone was unhappy. The majority were happy, but everyone, with very few exceptions, were careful how they lived their lives and what they said. Because it could have other implications. And East Germany was so poor in terms of resources. If you wanted something done, if you wanted to build a house, it was done through knowing someone. And if you didn't know that person, or you thought you offended one in the chain of your supply, then you cut off a very important line of supply. And
or if you were known as an outsider or someone that was starting to express dissident views, then you could be pushed to the side.
Well, if your thoughts were dangerous, why would you want to be associated with me? Because I could put you in danger with my thoughts.
Just for guilt by association.
Yeah, by association. If the beer table talk turns a bit more rough, and they'd be seen laughing at my anti-communist jokes, this is dangerous for them.
So you're almost setting a scene where you've got a population of people through psychological operations that are basically schooled into policing themselves and policing their own communities.
In a way, through
fear, through coercion.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
I mean,
ringing any bells, anyone?
Sorry, the clearest indication is that if you go back when the Stasi, as you know, was raided then by a large group of protesters at the time, and documents were found and so forth. It was then luckily in time sealed off. I'm not saying luckily for the Stasi, I'm saying luckily for the people who then 10 years later, I believe, I don't know the exact timeline, but everybody in East Germany had the right to view their record that was held by the Stasi, and there were very few people who didn't have one. And you could ask for that by mail or so forth. I know that a lot of people have asked for it. I was never interested, at the time that
you knew what to expect.
While I was there, I wasn't really bothered. But and that caused a huge rift amongst the population, or a large portion of the population, after the wall came down, because people realized, hang on, that was my neighbor who grasped me up back in 1976. That was my sister-in-law. That was my mother who told tales in school. And that was
so that had its own effects on the community when people found out
afterwards, 20 years later, 30 years later. Yeah, people got murdered on false accounts, on false accusations in those prisons of the Stasi. We must, sweep this under the carpet. It was, we had everything we needed to survive, but people with the wrong ideas lost their lives, and often because of a false accusation, or in some instances.
It's incredible.
Yeah. This is the power of the police state. No different than the Gestapo. Like I said, they had the perfect blueprint, and they implemented it. Although being in a less aggressive way, they did it more covertly.
Yeah, what you're telling me is literally sending shivers down my spine, because everyone that's watching this back is going to know why I've invited you here today. And thank you very much, Jay, for sharing that story with us. That's an insight that I have never really heard before. I've looked into what happened in the onset of the Soviet Union, in Russia, in the gulags. I've looked into Alexander Solzhenitsyn, Gulag Archipelago, etc. I've never actually really heard an account like yours from someone that lived in East Germany. Now, before we bring this right up to current day, we had a little chat before we started the interview, and you said that you started to see signs of this. I call it the mono state. No left, the illusion of left and right, as far as I'm concerned, that died in 2020. Tell me what signs you saw which triggered your memory of living in East Germany over here.
Well, it's not. We're not just talking about 2021 or 2020.
Sure.
I've been saying this at gatherings of friends and family for 10 years now, that I can see the signs of a more increasing state control here, especially in the UK. It was called they're politically correct. That was the umbrella. That was the banner under which many things started in this country. Politically correct is if you express an opinion that was wayward.
That started in the 90s. Political correctness started in the 90s.
Well, there you go.
Well, let's be real. What the Berlin Wall came down in what year? 89.
89.
I remember watching it. I've spoke about this before at protests. I remember watching the Berlin Wall coming down. I was only 6 years old. I wasn't old enough to remember the historical context, to understand the historical context, the political context. But I saw the raw emotion of the people climbing up the wall and bringing it down. So straight after that, political correctness is input into our psyche in the UK. Maybe not in the 90s, but 10 years ago, I was thinking political correctness. It's Orwellian.
Where a population had a desire to be free again after 40-odd years of dictatorial rule by a singular party of very questionable motives. So here was a whole population being observed freeing itself. A dangerous president. A dangerous president. While it was applauded in many Western countries, it was also viewed with suspicion. And of course, there had to be a ripple effect, because if it can happen there, it can happen here. There weren't similar reasons or why anybody in the UK would have the thought of 1990 of toppling a government and creating a different state, because you cannot draw any similarities. There simply weren't any. I don't think there was that much of a widespread discontent, although you had your minus issues in the 80s and so forth.
Poll tax protest, thing here and there. Yeah,
you've had the odd things that flared up, but on the whole, it was a pretty free society, I would say. And anything that British stood for a long time.
Certainly compared to the society that you've just illustrated, you grew up in. Absolutely. Yes. Maybe not everyone in this society was taken care of quite so well.
No, it's a capitalist society.
Yeah, and that's a whole different discussion about the pros and cons of a welfare state, etc., etc. So you said political correctness was the first alarm bell that started to ring in the 90s when you were already living in the UK. You said 1998?
1998, yeah.
Yeah, well, that's when the back end of the 90s was when political correctness really reared its ugly head, in my opinion. And what else did you notice?
Well, I've noticed that there was, Germany is a very, very controlled state anyway. Bureaucracy it's a very accepted part of German life. Everything has to be a piece of paper, everything a form, every signature for everything in life. So that's something you accept, because it also aids a well-oiled state machine in other departments, social welfare and so forth. So it's an accepted way of life. But I've noticed also in the UK, and once I bought my first house and so forth, I've noticed that whenever you had to fill in a form or somewhere else, the questions became increasingly more personal. About your way of life, about your habits, outside the realm of whatever the subject matter touched on.
Yeah.
So I found that a bit worrying. Why does a bank need to know on my mortgage application what sex or orientation I am? So forth. Why does it matter? And today on the forums, you're being asked what you feel. Your ethnical background is what you feel.
What you identify as.
What I identify is. I know what I am. Yeah. Nature tells me what I am.
Nature dictates what I am. I have no choice in that.
So that span from benign, normal organizational questions to the intrusive, gathering of information to get a better picture about you as an individual. I've seen the progression of it, a worrying progression of it. And anybody who filled in the census in the last few weeks would have looked at these questions and would have said, "What the hell's going on here?"
What census? Is there a census?
Yeah.
I don't know anything about it. Anyway, so yeah, I can imagine that is a Soviet trait. The state wants to know everything about you, every intrinsic, pointless little detail. I've noticed it. Some of the surveys that come through the door or the forms, a government form. You're right. Why does it need to know what your sexual orientation is?
Well, you've also got, because the subject of questions about your personal life and your person itself is in a capitalist society is twofold. Now it feeds commerce as well as it feeds government. So there's two people with the high tech companies, big tech companies, and the government. Now they're all interested in what you're all about. One wants to sell you something, one wants to control you as much as they can. So there's a two-pronged attack really on our whole thinking and on our whole being.
Sure. And when you started to, you said you were voicing these concerns to your friends in the UK in the late 90s at the pub, gatherings. What was the reaction from people?
People were laughing at me. Like they laughed at Donald Trump in 2016. Just a comparison. Not saying that I support the man, but who doesn't? So
can you see my pillow?
So they were laughing at me. They said he's another escaped paranoid East German. Yeah, and I thought,
yeah, I can see someone trying to paint that narrative. Well, he's paranoid.
Older, think, let him laugh. Now in 2021, when I speak to friends and family, especially those who now have to undergo all the procedures of the Wu flu actions, not many are laughing now.
No, they're not. So let's bring it up to date. We're now living in the year 1 AC, après Coviet. Yeah, as Lord Schwab, he wanted to start at the year 0. We'll talk about Klaus Schwab a little bit in a moment. So now here we are in the year 2021. We've had one whole year of this crazy regime. I call it like a technocratic regime. It's a regime of dominance, of absolute control, of wanting to know everything about you and control everything about your life. Are you surprised that this has happened so easily?
No, people give their consent.
Thank you.
People give their consent by abstaining their objections. That is as simple as that. And now the few who have voiced their concerns, and everybody has the right to voice their concerns, who went out into the streets, because that's one of the places where you're more likely to be heard than your own living room or the toilet you sit on while you read the paper. When they go out in the streets, it becomes a mob. And when the general media calls a protester a mob, and an elderly lady who gets shoved outside, bundled into a police dog car outside the House of Parliament while witnessed by an MP, is part of the mob, then there is a lot to be questioned here for anybody. It is condoned by the people. You, Britain, let it happen. You learned nothing from Germany. You're too complacent. Because I'm not British. I don't count myself in, although I'm in many ways more patriotic than you will ever be. No one was more offended by the attack on Winston Churchill statue in London than I. And I thought that our prime minister, your prime minister, failed the nation. He should have made a stand there and then, but he can't, because he's a woke-driven puppet. He's
riddled with political correctness.
And because he's advancing in years, 1 or 2 more years, he's our British Joe Biden. That's all he is. So and people need to wake up. This country is the birthplace of modern democracy.
Yes,
and it's become the laughingstock around the world in many aspects.
I completely agree with you.
I'm hurt by this because this country's been good to me. It's been here since 1998. I have very few bad things to say about this country, but one is that you've lost your spine.
And that was something that we were famous for, if I'm not mistaken. The British stiff upper lip, the spirit of the fighting Englishman. Where the hell has that gone? Where is it?
Well, it's not. I remember when I lived in Canada, and they were the time when the province of Quebec tried to split up from the rest of Canada, and they had very little to offer on their own, and it was a case of staying in or staying out. And there was a lot of radio programs going on there. And there was this particular lady broadcaster, and she said at the time, every nation deserves the government that it elects. So, and I thought,
we get what we deserve.
Yeah, you elected these people. Johnson sits there, the bumbling blonde clown. He sits there in London because he was protest. Nobody wanted Labour in. Everybody wanted to see this Brexit farce through. So that it was just a convenience vote. It was not a convincing popular vote. Putin gets voted in by popularity, and a large percentage. And so they Trump.
I'd vote for Putin and Trump
tomorrow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Look,
I'd rather have some family connections to Putin by association through hunting back in the day. But yeah, I'd rather have a strong and flawed leader
who
looks
strong
after
man,
its people and its nation than a weak bumbling clown.
Yeah, who's manipulatable by various different outside forces. So when this rolled out a week and a year ago, and they said 2 weeks to flatten the curve on the TV, Boris and his henchmen, what were your initial thoughts?
I banned the news in our house on the 2nd of April last year, I think.
Okay, so you got
mainstream news.
You basically got one week of it. Then you banned it 1 week. That's good timing.
When I saw some accounts, at first I took it as serious as anyone should at the time, because it was unknown, it was frightening. It came over here when the cause of it was largely denied or watered down to some sort of acceptable solution, that the bats got the shits in China and all of a sudden became the cause. Then I thought the lies are starting already. And when people who died of a blood disease in a hospital or of any other reason then were listed as COVID deaths, when the numbers no longer look credible, I started to think, why would you want to do that? And then, of course, I got taken back to my youth. It's the control through fear. Unless people are afraid, you don't control them, or you can control them with monetary terms, with incentives, or on a positive side with incentives. But you can, on the negative side, fear is the best.
Fear is the mind killer.
Fear is the best control of the people, and it worked. I mean, these false documentaries coming out of Italy at the time, and when they were proven to be, some of them to be falsified and staged, it took everything away from it.
Do you mean when you say documentaries? Do you mean some of the insights into the hospitals of like the people?
That's right.
Yeah, they were showing the same hospital room in New York and Italy.
Yeah. Quite.
So you've clearly done your research into this current situation outside of the mainstream media. Do you think, what are your thoughts on the actual pathogen, on the virus? Because some people don't believe it even exists. Some people think it's...
But listen, I'm not a denier. I know I'm a doctor in a hospital. I don't know, people are clearly dying. There's more people dying than an annual winter flu that you get. That's for sure.
Well, winter flu doesn't exist anymore, also, which helps.
So they say, but you know that seasonally more people. We're surrounded where I live by older people, and I can tell you that comes the autumn, both of our either side neighbors are in their 80s and 90s, and they quarantine themselves for a couple of weeks every year. They go through a bit of the weather change, gets a bit wetter, gets colder. They suffer a little bit from a mild cold or whatever you want to call it. So there's a bit of seasonal thing to it. People are less likely to get more ill in the winter than in the summer. So I'm not a doctor and anything. I'm not professed to know anything about whether this is real or it's not. What does concern me, if it is real, I think everybody's gone about it the wrong way, and dealing with this.
Yeah.
Why all these everything is just a reaction to hypothesis quite often, not even to founded facts. If you take the state of Florida, we've never shut down, and some of these comparisons.
Seems to be doing okay. I've seen some recent reports out of Florida. The beaches are full, people are in the restaurants and bars, and everyone seems to be doing okay.
If there weren't so many harebrained decisions forced upon us, I would have thought, okay, some measures, if you want to implement them, that's fine. If you think it's serious, you want to control it. But it's been going on too harebrained for too long. And we're not at the end yet. I mean, once they have been seen to have defeated this thing, that's what they're going to call it when they're done with it, when they've vaccinated a few people or enough of them, it's all going to shake out in the wash. I mean, look at this. The wall came down in 1990, 89, 90. It wasn't until 2000, the 2010s quite often that the real dirty washing came out.
The real dirty washing, and there's a lot of dirty washing.
And the real truth, what's going on, of course, what we will experience, and a lot of these so-called scientists, I mean, they all have advanced years. They either be too tappy, too senile to stand trial for anything, or will be avoided altogether. So that's what I'm talking about. we're going to have a two-generation gap now. We've got the snowflakes, we've got the woks, we've got the lefties, we've got the pimple-faced little university creeps who don't know shit about life yet. They contributed zero to society. Sorry if I've offended anybody.
No,
They
please
contributed
carry
nothing
on.
yet to society. Like little Greta Thunberg, yet they want to tell us what we've done wrong. My generation, the 50, 60, 70 years old, older than myself. They are hopeless. They are not the hope that anybody needs to pin on right now. It'll take a couple of generations to wake up and says what happened to normality, what happened to respect, what happened to lateral democracy, what happened to all these things. And somebody will go back to the history books and said that actually wasn't so bad. That worked pretty well for the people. Why did they ever stray from this path? And then there'll be a turnaround. But right now, in my opinion, the next 20, 40 years is just we're on a downhill slide.
Yeah, well, I hate to be pessimistic, but I can't.
No, that's an optimistic view of it.
That's an optimistic
Oh, that's
view.
it, yeah.
Shit. So, well, my next question was going to kind of be like, where do you see this going? And you've just zoomed out and you've gone 20, 40 years, right? Let's zoom in a little bit more.
This is my humble opinion. I mean, you need to listen to the learned people, the clever people. That is, Lord Sumption, for example, is one of the guys. Who
Lord Sumption has been
law.
speaking out up against this a lot.
Yeah, he's been speaking out and speaking up and speaking sense. But these are learned people. I don't need to be listened to by anyone. I just have a humble opinion from my experience. But
I think you've got an amazing insight, which gives you a point of reference, which no one else that's talking about this or I've spoke to has, because you have grown up in a society which in an aspect is, I think, where we're heading towards with the control of free will movement, free speech.
Mm-hmm.
Whether everyone's going to be looked after as well as they were in the Soviet Union, that remains to be seen. So, I think you've got an excellent insight. So I do think you're very worth listening to, Jay, to be fair. So 20, 40 years down the line, you think maybe we might have sorted out these problems. What do you see from what you've seen so far and what you observed 10, 20 years ago? What do you think is going to happen in the next couple of years as this is rolled out further and further? Yeah,
this is what I'm touching on. That's why I mentioned Lord Sumption. I agree with him 100% when he said that some of our inherent rights that we took for granted up until now, or you took for granted. When I'm addressing you, I mean the English. I'm looking from the other side of the fence. Nevertheless, I'm with you. You will never regain, and he is right about that. The law that are being passed now on public assembly and demonstrations, they will stay in place forever. They will not be returned unless there's a radical change of government and mindset. And let's hope it will be democratic when that happens one day down the line.
Sure.
The problem is that if you've got a moderate group of voting citizens, a moderate group who go to work, who do the thing, bring up the children, whatever, and they're being more and more restricted in the thinking, in the comprehension of how the world works, if they're more and more restricted and being told what to do, you drive in that particular group of people to the extreme, whether they start out on the right or they start out on the left. You drive them somewhere where they don't want to be. Their thinking changes, and it changes from the disbelief, from the incredulous, from the disapproving to the perhaps more malicious way of thinking. Well, if I can change it with my voice, if I can change it with my vote, then I have to change it somehow differently. And I'm talking about moderate people. This is the danger that Lord Sumption also warns about. That
I think we're already there.
If you push your people too far, then this is a situation that cannot be resolved, by appeasing a mass that you alienated.
Well, even before this happened, I always was under the impression that left and right politics, the idea there was actually any choice in those two parties, was illusionary. I think after what's happened in the last year, anyone that's even slightly paying attention has probably come to that conclusion as well. With what's just happened in the US with their election, I think people saying that is the end of democracy.
You mean the selection? That was no election.
The selection.
That was a selection. They selected a senile pedophile to be the president of the United States. I mean, give me a break. Sorry.
Yeah. No, believe me, that you don't need to put. We're not pulling any punches. We are fully on board with that. We've talked about Biden almost every week, showing stupid memes of all of the ridiculous things he's doing. He's just put Hunter Biden, his son, a convicted crackhead, in the head of the DEA, the Drugs Enforcement Agency. If that's not clown world, I really don't know what is. So yeah, I can't say that I disagree with anything you've said so far. I've been watching this roll out. I've been researching this, as Andy knows, for a very long time, for like best part of 20 years. The military-industrial complex, the leftover Bolshevik mindset that seems to have infected the world elites. Bill Gates and all his cronies, which are now the hitmen of what I call the Coviet Union. And let's just talk about that a little bit, because earlier on I said to you, I coined this term, the Coviet Union, because I think we're heading to something like the Soviet Union. And what did you say to that?
That's a bit of an insult to the Soviet Union.
It's an insult. Yeah. You heard it here first.
Yeah.
Calling it the Coviet Union is actually an insult to the Soviet Union, and you've heard it here directly from the mouth of a man that lived under the Iron Curtain.
Well, everybody's just got a certain assumption of something that took place 30, 40 years ago. It's of course, history can be written. It's written by certain people, and some of them put their own opinions within a certain textbook.
Yeah, you could say that.
And everything else. And then it becomes the gospel. And the snowflake reads it now and thinks, now that's history. Now this is a snippet of it. And like with all things, you got to take it all with a pinch of salt. So Soviet Union, by and large, and also there are different people. You cannot compare the two of them. There are people that like to be ruled. There were a large majority of very poor peasant Russian, citizens at the time. We're talking, especially going back a little bit of time, the revolution. But they are best lived and best managed when they're controlled, and they like to be controlled. Why do you think Putin is so popular now? Why do you think Stalin was, despite all the atrocities, was such a popular man in Russia? They were still popular. Of course, they killed millions. Oh, he in particular, Stalin, I'm talking, got rid of millions of otherwise thinking opponents of that. That's not, but he was still
Ukrainian farmers and peasants.
Yeah, but they were
Polacks.
A lot of them will say they were never off better than when they were under a control of a leader, on the leadership. I mean, Putin's popularity is beyond measure in comparison to the bumbling clown in London and the pedophile in Washington.
Yeah, because I don't think Putin partakes in those dirty things that the others do. I think Putin's a real man. I've got a lot of respect for him. I don't, and when I sort of winced at a moment there, because it sounded like a moment you were putting him totally in the same category as Stalin, but then you sort of said, well, Stalin was the one that killed allegedly hundreds of millions.
What we mustn't forget that look at the size of the country that he's got to look after, plus the Russia,
massive,
or his administration, plus the formerly affiliated states. Some of them are breakaway states, some of them now autonomous states. They're still under one, continental roof over there. This is a big thing to manage, and he still manages with popularity. And I don't think this will be matched. And we are. The world is lucky to have him right now. They should count themselves lucky, because he's a stabilizer.
Imagine if he wasn't there.
Huge stabilizer. Well, look what happened. Look at history. Look when you take stabilizers out of the equation. Look at Saddam Hussein.
Gaddafi.
If you take some of these stabilizers out of the equation, what happens then? So to answer your question, I think it's a bit of it's not quite as bad. The Soviet Union.
Not as bad, or an insult to the Soviet Union.
Yeah, they weren't quite as bad now.
This leads really nicely into my final question, and we'll wrap it up with this one. You've given an amazing insight into life in East Germany under the Stasi, how it relates to what's going on now. What advice would you give to people if they are dealing with these agents of the Coviet Union, whether it's COVID wardens, census people coming to the door? From your experience, what advice would you give to our viewers of how to deal with these people to try and rise above it?
Well, you don't rise above it. First of all, you confront it, and you confront it in a well-founded, knowledgeable manner. You make yourself knowledgeable on the laws that protect you. You make yourself knowledgeable on what the police are allowed and not allowed to do. What rights do they have? What powers do they have in given situations? Sometimes they are allowed to kick your door, and you have to confront the situation as it comes to you. But you have to be sure of your rights and defend and protect them. It doesn't mean that you have to be in all cases uncooperative with them. Quite often they're legitimate things. Well, when it comes just down to this Wu-flu situation and how it's being followed up by some bullies that wear a little vest and claim to be official, wardens, police officers, or part of the police. You confront that with the surety of a person who knows his rights as a free. You fought for those rights. England, Britain is a fount of modern democracy. Don't see them washed away. Make yourself seen and heard, and do it in a manner which Britain always has done, with a stubborn politeness. You know, and if that doesn't work, then you have to resort to other measures. Make yourself heard in demonstration, even though if they are prohibited. Who prohibits us from walking outside into the fresh air and gathering and voicing our concerns? Nobody says that you should torch the House of Parliament, although Guy Fawkes apparently was the only guy who ever went there with honest intentions. You know, that's for sure.
Yeah.
I'm just saying, make yourself knowledgeable. Do not be intimidated. You know, half the people that come to your door have got a quarter of your education. You know, do not be intimidated by a badge, by a camera, by a set of handcuffs, by a torch, by a pencil sharpener, whatever other paraphernalia to carry on the belt looking like clowns. I'm not saying you should disrespect them altogether, but talk to them as equals and not as your wardens. You're not imprisoned.
Unless we choose to be.
Unless you choose to be.
And it's all about consent, isn't it?
It is about consent. You know, the one thing that always crops up is the pressing police or official question, or in some question as understand. I object to that term. You know, I've never been really that aware of it for over the last year. But yeah, it is right. We do not stand under. We comprehend. We hear. We listen.
On our show, we say from one of our members, Inner Guardians, we have a saying: we don't understand, we inner stand. Yeah. The Rastas say overstand, don't stand under them, stand over. Here on Rise Above, we say inner stand, and I think well, you've just wrapped it up there really nicely. Confront them with a stubborn politeness, with knowledge, with confidence, and don't be intimidated by, like you say, pencil sharpeners and high-vis jackets and clipboards, because at the end of the day, these people have just signed up to a job because they probably lost another job. Because of the Coviet Union. Jay, I want to say a massive thank you for coming to the studio today.
My pleasure.
It's been a real insight, and I hope the viewers have enjoyed it. Hearing directly from the horse's mouth someone that's lived under an oppressive regime. Thank you again.
Pleasure.
Thank you so much, mate. Right, guys, we'll see you next time.